You know that feeling of playing a supporting role in your own life? Jake thought he was overthinking it, until the day he swapped a glass of sangria and saved his own skin. What seemed like a petty grudge from his mother-in-law turned into a plot straight out of a crime show. Who would have guessed that a family dinner would uncover a poisoning attempt and, even worse, all the dark secrets buried under fake smiles and Sunday meals? Some people swear betrayal only hurts when it comes from your partner. But the truth is, the worst stab usually comes from where you least expect it, from those who hug you tight just to hide the knife. In this story, you'll see how a man everyone underestimated became the heart of the twist. You'll understand how humiliation was just the beginning, and how revenge can come in the subtlest form, success and truth. And in the end, the one who tried to destroy ended up exposing everything they wanted to keep hidden. Jake was never the paranoid type, but there's a moment in life when instinct speaks louder than logic. It was just another night, family dinner, forced laughs, and a sangria served with a little too much enthusiasm. Linda, his mother-in-law, kept insisting he drink. But something in that tight stare and cold smile made Jake pause. Quietly, he switched glasses with his father-in-law, Robert. Minutes later, Robert was sick to his stomach, and Jake, even in shock, knew betrayal was in the glass. It's funny how the body senses what the mind hasn't processed. Jake watched the scene like someone watching a dark play. Father-in-law dizzy, mother-in-law pretending to be worried, and Emily, his wife, completely unaware of the masked humiliation he had been enduring for years. It wasn't the first time he felt undermined in that house. But now the situation had a bitter taste, literally. Revenge wasn't even a plan yet, but the seed was there, being watered by the poison meant for him. When someone tries to sabotage you like that, it's not just your body that reacts, it's your soul. Jake took a deep breath and realized overcoming this would take proof, not yelling. This wasn't a family argument. It was a covert operation disguised as dinner. And if you've ever had to swallow your pride while people smiled fake smiles at you, you know exactly how he felt. And you know that sometimes the only answer is strategic silence. Robert, the father-in-law, even while getting sick, insisted it was just one of those age things. But Jake already had something else in mind. He saved the glass carefully, like someone collecting evidence from a crime scene. This wasn't about drinks. It was about broken trust. It was betrayal wrapped in family ties. And if you've ever been hit by that kind of emotional poison, you know how slowly it eats away at you. Jake wasn't out for revenge, not yet, but he wanted raw truth, and fast. That's why so many people get lost in the middle of chaos. They don't realize that some battles aren't won by brute force, but by smart moves. Jake decided to act like a man who knew what he was doing, even if he didn't have all the answers. He took that glass, left the house early, and the next day he was already at a lab with it in hand. When you live under constant judgment, you know that one detail can change everything. And Jake was about to find out that the detail was the poison itself. And the most ironic part? Linda had no idea she'd been outplayed by her own arrogance. While she smiled smugly, thinking she had won, Jake was already 2 steps ahead. The greatest weapon of someone who's always underestimated is knowing how to look harmless. But now, with the game about to flip, something much bigger than a spiked drink was beginning to unfold. Jake had always been patient, but patience isn't the same as being passive. Since the beginning of his relationship with Emily, he had noticed the subtle jabs from Linda and the silent disdain from Robert. It was like his job as a photographer wasn't serious enough for a family that saw themselves as morally superior. "When are you going to get a real job?" Linda would say it with a smile, but Jake could feel the poison underneath. It wasn't just teasing, it was humiliation dressed as concern. The hardest part of being in an environment like that is constantly trying to seem worthy in the eyes of people who will never accept you. And it's not about merit, it's about control. Jake worked hard, sold photo shoots, booked campaigns, and still got labeled as some kind of artistic handyman. And strangely enough, that kind of disdain cuts deeper than direct insults. Emotional betrayal is born from that forced silence, from that subtle effort to convince you that you're less. That's how the cycle begins. A lot of people have lived through that kind of invisibility, whether at work, in family, or even in romantic relationships. And here's the big lesson. Who you are doesn't depend on anyone's approval. Jake knew he didn't need to prove himself, but he also knew that ignoring the issue wouldn't fix it. When you realize you're being constantly put down, that's the sign. It's time to draw the line. And believe me, setting boundaries isn't rude. It's emotional self-defense. The tricky part is those attacks often come wrapped in polite gestures. A family dinner, a gift out of nowhere, a seemingly thoughtful invitation. Jake learned that true toxicity doesn't always yell. It compliments you to your face and discredits you behind your back. And the more you swallow it, the harder it gets to break free. It's not just about resilience, it's about identity. Emily, on her end, had grown up in that kind of environment. And like many people, she couldn't see the weight of constant manipulation. Jake never blamed her for it, but he knew that if he didn't bring the truth to light, with facts and courage, he'd be feeding the same cycle. Revenge wasn't about Linda or Robert anymore. It was about the idea that he had to quietly take it all. It was about breaking free from years of being treated like an afterthought. While most people just go along to keep the peace, Jake chose a different path, not out of anger, but clarity. Because there comes a time when silence no longer protects. It only traps. And if you've ever been through something like this, you know. Once the truth starts rising, there's no stuffing it back under the rug. And Jake was ready to dig even deeper. Jake wasn't a detective, but he started acting like one. That saved glass turned into material evidence, and the lab confirmed what his gut had already screamed. Benzodiazepines. Yes, a controlled drug, a sedative. The kind that wipes your memory or takes away your control. This wasn't a mistake, it was an attempted setup. Not the metaphorical kind. It was real, calculated betrayal that could have ended very badly. But as they say, people who dig graves with arrogance usually forget to cover them properly. In Jake's mind, everything suddenly made sense. The probing questions from his mother-in-law, the attempts to stir up conflict with Emily, the fake smiles. He began connecting the dots, piecing together a puzzle he didn't know existed. And the best part? Every new discovery was healing. Because once you start seeing clearly, humiliation turns into insight. And that clarity is what transforms fear into power. Digging deeper, Jake found out that Linda had a history of manipulation. Former church friends, old neighbors, even a former family therapist spoke of obsessive control, misuse of medication, and relationships destroyed by sheer toxicity. Emily had never mentioned any of it. She just thought her mom was difficult. But it wasn't just difficulty. It was a pattern, a dangerous one, hidden behind a mask of maternal concern. Jake realized knowing the truth wasn't enough. He needed proof. Because anyone who's been in a toxic relationship knows. Without evidence, the victim becomes the villain. That's why he started documenting everything. Conversations, texts, subtle clues. Like a true strategist, he knew that overcoming this situation would require intelligence, not impulse. And if you've ever been in his shoes, you know how hard it is not to explode. But that's exactly where you win. The hardest thing about dealing with manipulators is that they're good at playing the victim. Jake knew Linda would twist the story, so his mission was clear. Reveal the truth in a way no one could deny. And that takes preparation. Emotional structure. It's not just about being right. It's about presenting the truth so sharply that no one can unsee it. It's like photography. It's not enough to see the image. You've got to focus it for everyone else to see it too. Even with all of that, Jake hesitated. Because cutting ties with a family figure hurts, even when they've tried to destroy you. But deep down, he knew. If he wanted a clean future, he had to face the past head on. And when truth begins creeping out of the shadows, something unexpected can happen. Especially when the next piece of the puzzle doesn't come from you, but from someone inside the family. Jake was tangled in an invisible web, but he wasn't alone anymore. That's when Sarah, his sister-in-law, messaged him. She'd always been the observant type, the kind of person who blends into the background but sees everything. The message? Footage from the security cameras at her parents' house. Jake hesitated to open it. Maybe he was scared to confirm what he already suspected. But once he hit play and saw Linda messing with the drinks, pills in hand, there was no doubt left. This was premeditated betrayal, caught in high definition. What disturbed him most wasn't the sabotage, it was how casually she did it. Like it was just another part of her day. In the footage, Linda even says to Robert, "Jake can't keep getting in the way of Emily's future." That cut deep, yet strangely, it also gave Jake relief. Because if you've ever been discredited, you know how powerful, undeniable proof can be. And there it was. Truth raw and clear, louder than any defense. Sarah also shared voice recordings, old conversations, and, most shocking of all, an old plan Linda had tried to pull off years ago with Emily's ex-boyfriend. That hit Jake like a freight train. Linda didn't want what was best for her daughter. She wanted control. Jake realized his story was just another chapter in this woman's long history of sabotage. And if you've ever had someone like that in your life, you know how they always frame it as doing what's best for the family, until you realize the family's just their shield. That's why evidence is stronger than speeches. It leaves no room for spin. Jake now had something that would flip the entire game. And not just for him, for Emily, Ryan, her brother, and Sarah. Slowly, they too were waking up to the manipulation they had lived under for years. This was a rare opportunity, not just to break free themselves, but to set everyone else free too, the ones who'd never been allowed a voice. The siblings, now united and fueled by Jake's courage, were ready. For the first time, Jake wasn't the only one trying to prove something. They were a group, with buried pain, hidden truths, and a shared realization. They'd all been played for years. It was like turning on the lights in a room that had been dark for too long. Everything looked ugly at first, but it was finally time to clean it up. With all that evidence in hand, confrontation was inevitable. But unlike dramatic movie scenes, real-life confrontations with emotionally powerful family members take more than bravery. They take strategy. And Jake, now armed with undeniable facts and unexpected allies, knew his next move wasn't just to expose the truth, but to break the cycle once and for all. The day of the confrontation came the way big moments in life usually do. Without music, without a spotlight, but with a pressure in the air that you feel in your chest. Jake gathered Emily, Sarah, and Ryan in the parents' living room. There were no screams, no theatrics. Just facts, proof, and a silence that, for the first time, roared louder than any argument. Jake hit play on his phone and let the videos speak. The betrayal wasn't a suspicion anymore. It was a full-on revelation. And when truth walks into the room, masks fall off. Linda tried to laugh. A nervous, mocking laugh like someone still pretending to be in control. "This doesn't prove anything," she said. But Emily's face said it all. She knew. It was like, in that moment, every weird memory from childhood suddenly made sense. Small comments, strange feelings, moments she could never explain. Now, they all connected. And Robert? He tried to stay composed, but he looked pale. Because sometimes, the worst kind of humiliation is losing your disguise in front of your own kids. Ryan, always the quiet one, was the first to break the silence. "How many times did you manipulate us and we thought it was just you caring too much?" His question hung in the air. Sarah, her eyes glassy, followed up. "You raised us not to trust anyone, not even ourselves." And that was it. Revenge, in that room, wasn't yelling or drama. It was calmly exposing every piece of emotional control they had dressed up as advice. It was a moment of shared healing, of collective clarity. Jake stood firm. Not out of coldness, but because he knew exactly what that moment meant. If you've ever had to confront someone who's belittled you for years, you know how heavy that moment is. But you also know the freedom that comes right after. Because when the truth is finally laid bare, it doesn't need a defense, it stands on its own. And Jake wasn't just doing this for himself. He was doing it for an entire family that had been living in emotional silence. Linda tried to spin it, said it was all misinterpreted love, too much concern, just a mother's way. But no one bought it anymore. Emily looked at her as if she were seeing her for the first time, as a flawed woman with toxic habits and destructive choices. And that stung. Because overcoming betrayal from someone who was supposed to protect you is like cutting off a piece of your soul. But sometimes, that's the only way to grow without shackles. The talk didn't end in hugs or reconciliation, but in something more powerful. Clarity. No one stormed out. No one cried on anyone's shoulder. But the energy shifted. The cycle had been broken. The truth had been spoken. And even without forgiveness, there was a release. Jake didn't win because he shouted louder. He won because he had the guts to expose what had been buried for years. And once the silence was broken, something new began to take root. Something that would grow stronger with the arrival of a new member in the family. Life felt lighter after that, but not any easier. A few months after the confrontation, Emily got pregnant, and the baby's arrival gave everything new urgency. Protecting their future now meant redrawing boundaries in the present. Jake and Emily set firm rules. No surprise visits, no decisions about the child without their say. When they told Linda and Robert, there was tension in the air, but this time it wasn't a negotiation. It was a declaration. Their healing wasn't emotional, it was structural. Funny enough, Linda began to behave more cautiously. The arrogance faded into something that looked like quiet respect. There were no apologies, no heartfelt moments, but there was distance. And that, to Jake, was a strategic win. Because anyone who's lived under manipulation knows, saying no is one of the most powerful forms of revenge. Not the kind that hurts, but the kind that rebuilds your dignity. And in families, that's worth more than gold. The baby's birth marked a turning point. Jake now saw himself not just as a husband but as a father. And with that came a new mission. Never let his child grow up under the same emotional control Emily had endured. It was time to break cycles, not repeat them. And that required consistency. It wasn't enough to set rules. They had to model them. And as we all know, kids don't learn from what we say. They learn from what we do. The first few months were awkward. Visits were rare, stiff. Linda tried to act like the loving grandma, but every time she stepped over the line, she got shut down. Politely but firmly. Robert, more quiet now, seemed to understand the new boundaries. Maybe he realized too late the damage they'd done. But Jake didn't waste time waiting for silent guilt to turn into apologies. What mattered now was the emotional safety of their new family. And in this new phase, clarity meant more than fake affection. Emily, once afraid to challenge her mom, began standing her ground. It wasn't overnight, but with Jake beside her and the baby in her arms, she found a strength she didn't know she had. Years of humiliation became lessons. Her mother's betrayal became emotional maturity. And if you've ever had to say enough to the person who raised you, you know how much it hurts. But you also know the deep relief that follows. The funny part? Linda never said she was sorry, but she did start to change. Maybe out of fear of losing access to her grandson. Maybe out of shame. Maybe just exhaustion. But something shifted in her. Jake didn't let his guard down, but he watched. Because sometimes, change doesn't come from love. It comes from consequence. And right there, in the middle of a reordered family dynamic, a tiny seed of respect began to quietly grow. And here's the irony. It was Robert, the same man who once said photography wasn't real work, who ended up praising Jake's talent. After flipping through a feature Jake had shot for a local architecture magazine, he said, "This looks like something straight out of New York." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a hug, but it was something. A quiet recognition from someone who used to mock him. And sometimes the sweetest kind of revenge is being praised by the very people who tried to bring you down. Jake didn't need their validation, but it still felt good, because anyone who's been doubted knows what it's like to build their worth brick by brick. He'd spent years hearing that he was just playing with cameras, years being the punchline at family dinners, always treated like he didn't quite measure up. Now, his name was in magazines, his work in galleries, his brand on campaigns. This wasn't revenge, it was evolution. Emily had witnessed that transformation up close, and the admiration in her eyes meant more to Jake than any pat on the back from her parents. He understood that real success isn't about status, it's about freedom. Freedom to be yourself, to create without permission, to live without constantly explaining yourself. And when you've been through betrayal and humiliation, that kind of freedom feels like finally exhaling after holding your breath for years. Photography wasn't just Jake's job, it was his answer to the world. Sure, Linda never said sorry, neither did Robert, but their behavior changed. They walked on eggshells. The snide remarks stopped, the tone shifted. And that was enough, because when control breaks, the whole dynamic shifts. Jake wasn't looking for an apology, he was looking for his space to be respected. And he didn't get it handed to him. He earned it, slowly, deliberately. And that win? It spoke louder than any argument ever could. If you've ever been through a toxic relationship, this might sound familiar. That moment when you stop trying to be accepted and start respecting yourself. Jake no longer cared about fitting into their mold. He just wanted to be himself without explaining or shrinking. And the best part? He did it without yelling, without stooping, without playing their game. He stayed consistent, creative, and true to himself. And so, with his studio growing, his family finally safe, and peace gradually taking root, Jake looked back, not with bitterness, but with wisdom. He'd learned what most people never get to. The real victory isn't making others pay. It's stopping the price you pay trying to please everyone else. And now that this story had reached a whole new level, maybe it was time to tell how it all began. So let me ask you, how many times have you smiled just to keep the peace while swallowing a pain no one else could see? How many times has your voice been shut down just so you wouldn't seem ungrateful or dramatic? Jake's story might sound extreme, but what if it's just a clearer version of your own? Betrayal, humiliation, growth. These things don't just happen to other people. The difference is, some choose to break the cycle and build something new from the ashes. Now tell me this, are you really willing to keep hiding just to avoid conflict? Or is it time to take control of your story, like Jake did? Because the most powerful revenge isn't shouting or fighting back. It's growing so much that no one can minimize you again. If this story moved you or made you think, drop your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever gone through something like this? Ever felt underestimated? Share your truth. And if you want more stories like this, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. There's still a lot of truth left to uncover.